With that, I want to turn to our first presenter of the next panel. Stephen, are you ready?
I think we're going to need a break at some point.
At some point, yeah. We're a little bit tight on time, which is the challenge. Want to make sure everybody gets in, but let's move to the next set of presenters, and then depending on how we are in time, we will hopefully have a break soon.
Stephen, I don't actually know if mine are up there.
And let me just add, and thanks for suggesting that. This is not kindergarten. You do not need to ask permission to go to the bathroom. We've got some coffee in the back room, so please feel free to help yourself.
I'm Stephen Kapp, and I'll be speaking about the diagnostics of what is proposed to be autism spectrum disorder. So the psychiatry's diagnostic and statistical manual which is proposed to be released in May 2013, has proposed to merge the current diagnoses on the autism spectrum into a single diagnosis called ASD, which rigorously reflects the rigorous science that the current diagnoses lack validity between one another, even though it is a valid diagnosis together as compared to other diagnoses in the general population. And I hope this would lead to people currently diagnosed with autistic disorder having more opportunities, dignity, and people with currently diagnosed with Asperger's disorder, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, getting more access to services, but overall just that it would be more personalized, the different support efforts to help people, and that's the way it should be in general. And the diagnosis is now reflecting better the diverse range in the social manifestations of ASD, and I think it will be helpful that it's offering more examples throughout the core criteria of how the symptoms may appear, and that there will be more flexibility with the age of onset in early childhood, and that impairment results from the symptoms altogether rather than specific domains, which I think reflects, for example, that for some people they may actually be more impaired by the so-called behavioral domain of ASD rather than the social domain. And relatedly, there's also the problem that now it's requiring 3 of 3 criteria in the social domain to be met, and while there's evidence for each specific symptom, there's some subjectivity inherent in it, adaptive behavior to fit different social contexts, etc., and how it might be interpreted. And for example, now if you have normal conversational abilities to have a back and forth conversation, however you measure that reliably and validly, now you're no longer autistic. And there's not a lot, whereas historically there have been so many different pathways to the diagnosis, people needing to meet 2 out of 4, etc., and there isn't really a long history in the DSM of requiring 3 of 3 or requiring all of the criteria to be met for a specific domain of a diagnosis as complex as ASD. So in practice, it may be very problematic. And now they're creating, maybe reflecting some of the problems, this diagnosis of social communication disorder for the people currently diagnosed with PDD-NOS who have impairment in the social but not behavioral domains. And I think that reflects that true ASD actually affects more than just social functioning, but will it actually, but now they'll be considered part of a communication disorder, and will that actually improve their not just their identity or other efforts, but the quality of life and the different services and interventions, et cetera, available to them? But even more problematically, what about the people who meet the behavioral but not the social domain? There's no diagnosis proposed to them, I think, because autism has been constructed as so social when it's a very complex diagnosis, disability, and actually reflecting some of the other areas that are less mental and not specifically social, are that they're adding finally the sensory behaviors, and there's a lot of evidence for that. It may lead to better services such as occupational sensory integration therapy, other supports, and relatedly, I think there's a lot of evidence for movement-related kind of motor criteria, but they are not proposing to add that, even though I think there's evidence. And now they're historically proposing to remove speech production from the ASD diagnosis. And even though I think there's some science to that, there's a separate kind of biology of it and clinical aspects of it, will it actually reduce people's access to alternative and augmentative communication? At least on the positive side, that it shows that the ability to speak is not a function of ASD severity or people's competence, whatever that means. And so in general, psychiatry is moving toward more dimensional diagnoses, recognizing that they're a natural part of the way that people are, in a sense that that various diagnoses, disabilities are on a continuum, and one of them is, so they're proposing a severity scale. Now they're calling it about need for support. So on paper it looks good, but it's a very complex, not a linear disability, and people have all sorts of variable needs, and will it actually effectively promote quality of life? I have serious concerns about it in practice and how it might be interpreted, but but at least this dimensional concept recognizes that there's fluidity between different disabilities as well as between disabilities like autism and the general population, so allowing more cross-diagnosis with other disabilities, recognizing that there may be some overlap, but that those other disabilities are not ASD itself. And I think that will be important to helping people get the support that they need, and that there's will be a more accompanying language, which is pretty historic, to help guide practitioners and families, and that it's also, I think, new to the DSM, open to public feedback, because there are different criticisms of it, which allows various advocacy organizations, just individuals, to let their concerns be known. But another part that's still in development is DSM-wide, how will impairment be operationalized and measured? And I think that's a very important question. And with underserved populations that there are with adolescents and adults, well, historically, for most of autism's life, it's been thought of as part of childhood schizophrenia in the diagnostic, in the DSM, or infantile autism, and so the criteria weren't expanded toward until relatively recently. So there are lots of truly autistic people out there who don't have a diagnosis, and people, regardless of when or how they're diagnosed, or if they're diagnosed, people often learn various coping or compensatory strategies, and they may mask their behavior. And a lot of the gold standard, a big part of it, is basically conversations, that normal back and forth and all these other things I was talking about. And lots of autistic people with clear clinical histories in adulthood no longer appear autistic in it. And I think that there's no gold standard for how to measure it in adults, I would say, and how does it manifest? And I think we need to emphasize more about the history and the self-report, especially because, as the ADA Amendments Act acknowledges, that mitigating measures such as learned behavior, et cetera, do not disqualify people from being disabled, and there are various practices related to people losing or recovering from their diagnosis, and I think that's very ethically problematic. And there's also females are more likely, I think because of a lot of times because of things related to socialization, that they're more likely to have subtler symptoms and mass behavior, have pretend play and maybe make eye contact, or imitate and have maybe a friend, or be relatively shy and not as supposedly aggressive or anxious or passive. So it could be harder for people, it raises the question of whether it should actually be how the diagnostic practices and in the diagnosis itself, how sensitive it should be to these differences. And also with cultural minorities that, especially for something that's defined as so social, that groups with various different social practices and attitudes think about autism differently on average, and sometimes African Americans, Latinos, some Native Americans, some research suggests, are more accepting of ASD, and lower income people in general are less likely to have access to a diagnosis, and white higher income people are overrepresented in autism, among autism diagnoses. I think that's a problematic area that's not getting enough attention. And then that the diagnosis is defined by psychiatry means that there's, I think, often an overemphasis on medication, and there's chemical restraint sometimes used for very dubious reasons, and there's not a lot of research on the efficacy of medication for autism, and that there's an underemphasis on areas that are less related to the mind or more related to the body, such as the sensory and the more motor areas. And again, others have talked about the deficit basis, and a lot of traits are inherently neutral or positive in the diagnosis, like having restricted interests or certain, rituals, and certainly, some of the so-called simple motor stereotypies like arm flapping or body rocking, those are inherently neutral, and they actually serve as a coping mechanism for many autistic people. And so if we at least emphasize more of the challenges in the diagnosis, if we don't change fundamentally the way that it's conceptualized, then would that lead to more people actually getting support for their challenges? Or do we need just because something is atypical and in the DSM and associated with autism, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to reduce that behavior or however it manifests. But since it's defined at a more behavioral level, there's excessive behaviorism, people just trying to act normal for its own sake, or outsiders not really understanding why people are having the behaviors. I was already talking about with the so-called stimming or self-regulatory behaviors, for example. But on the other hand, the underlying nature of ASD, not just the biology, but also the different psychological theories, et cetera, there's so many controversies about it, and there's so much that's unknown. So I think a lot of autistic people and others would like it to be defined more in terms of sensory integration, cognitive, like attention, cognitive kind of flexibility or executive functioning, but maybe even emotion regulation in certain areas. But the way that it's that the DSM is now, that would probably lead to more over medication. But just to wrap up, that I don't know how it's ethical to say that a deficit in reciprocity can lie in just one person or in a relationship, and also just beyond autism, that disability is an interaction between factors specific to the condition as well as other personal factors and social factors. And so how do we can we be sensitive to this? Can the DSM actually reflect these complexities and nuances, or do we need a new classification system ultimately in the future, and what form would that take? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Anne Donnelly. Do we get the PowerPoint sorted out, or do we?
But it's coming.
Okay, that's fine. Well, while we're sorting this out, let me just pose a question to our audience. Are you enjoying yourselves? Absolutely. We're going to be taking a lunch break at 12:30. So, but we're all going to circle out and then come back for an afternoon session at 2:15. I guess since we have a little bit of time, we'll take two very brief questions. Do you want to come to the microphone to make that comment?
So I'm wondering to what extent it's vulnerability and to what extent it's in effect coercion, because very frequently that woman who who was the best advocate in her bunch because she had a restraining order against the school district, her options were probably bad or none, right? And she brought the law in to enforce none. And the standards are so low in what people choose from, back to your face cream point, that I think a great part of it is coercion. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about the funding process, which a couple of you have mentioned. A significant amount of funding of research comes from private nonprofits, and the decision-making process is even less transparent in that regard. And what I almost think that Anne's geologist has to say there's oil in the rocks rather than there are earthquakes to get funding, right? And I think we need to look at broader than just how the federal government makes its funding decisions. How do we move a whole economy that has private nonprofit players like Autism Speaks and others in it, influencing those decisions? How do we move that along too? Because you're not going to move the whole picture unless
I think that's actually exactly one of the topics that Anne is going to weigh in on. And since I see her PowerPoint, I
promise I'm not a ringer.
No, that's quite all right.
But it's a great segue.
But that was a great segue. So thank you very much, Phil, and Dr. Anne Donnelly, everyone.
Thank you. We were asked as part of this process to develop an abstract, and as I was doing that, I realized that what I wanted to talk about is some of the challenges to ethics in autism research. One that I won't be actually mentioning, Phil, but is that it's a lot easier to raise money from the public if you show poor little kids and desperate people and sell the negative. So I think that's one of the things we might speak about today. As I looked over a long history in this field, I realized that nothing stood out more for me than Rosnahan's notion of invented knowledge. That is, when the ratio of what we know to what we need to know approaches zero, we tend to invent knowledge and pretend we know more than we actually do. We seem unable to say, I don't know. I'm not talking about people being fraudulent. I'm not talking about people lying. I'm just talking about the need in an applied field, and my part of this field is applied research, is that we have far more that we need to accomplish than we actually have the knowledge to accomplish. And so sometimes we pretend that we know more than we actually do. Looking around the field, what I see is that we have a belief that we have a scientific objectivity, we have lots of unchallenged assumptions, and we have something I just learned about this week, which I like because it's got a lot of syllables and it makes you sound smart, is pseudo-speciation. So some of the unstated assumptions: one, as somebody's already mentioned today, we don't publish negative findings. We assume observed behavior is all there is to look at, that everything is learned and it is lawful across species. And I'm talking now particularly of the behavioral model, which is what I was trained in my schooling. And somehow that we believe that learning about contingency management is the same as learning about autism because the subject is autistic. But I'm not sure that that has contributed nearly as much as we think it has about autism. So in terms of the objectivity of science, I'm going to use facilitated communication as a case example. And if you have been on an ice floe for the last 20 years and don't know what that is, but it's the use of physical and emotional support in order to enable somebody to use an augmentative assistive device. And it's very controversial, and there's a great deal of worry about influence, and I think we should always be worried about influence if somebody's touching somebody else's hand while they're trying to communicate. But I've never seen such a rise of science in its way as I did over that particular issue. I have here an article from the American Psychologist in a section called Science Watch, and it's called The History of Facilitated Communication, Science, Pseudoscience, and Anti-Science, and it's from the Science Working Group on Facilitated Communication. If there were any doubt that this is a scientific paper, we mention it 5 times before we get to the first sentence. So one of my students and I, back when this was all going on, Jamie Davis, started looking back at the publications on facilitated communication, and then we looked at a larger issue of how often do people publish negative studies. In the rats and pigeons world that I was originally trained in, you published everything. Whatever you got, that's what you published, but not so much in human psychology. So we looked at, or she looked, because she did most of the work, at behavior therapy, education and training in mental retardation, the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, the Journal of Special Education, which what pretty much covered the field at that moment in time from 1983 to 1997. And we gave credit to any article that referred to unsupported intervention, even if that was just, well, we tried X and Y, and they didn't seem to be enough, so we did Z. Even that was considered, okay, the publication of a negative, of an unsupported finding. Does that make sense? It didn't have to be what the paper was about, but if it even mentioned that. And what we found was that there were 291 articles, 21 of them on the topic of communication unsupported. And not surprisingly, so that's only 11% of the articles reported unsupported intervention overall, but 23 articles were on facilitated communication, and 21 of them were on lack of support for facilitated communication. So that meant without the FC articles, there were only 4% of the articles reporting unsupported interventions, and 66% of the total of the results that were unsupported were about facilitated communication over that period of time. It's hard for me, yes? Oh, you're telling me something. I thought you were just waving. Thank you.
We wave to you all the time.
Yes, it's when all of that was going on, somebody at Time magazine said to me, boy, they really want to kill this thing, don't they? And she wasn't even looking at the research at the time. Okay, another area of specious notions, I think, of objectivity has to do with the code words that we use to try to represent our results and our reality. And one of them is the word recovery, which was used in the original paper by Dr. Lovas, may he rest in peace, who recovery was never really defined. But trust me, people were led to believe that it meant that this person became normal. I think that those of us who are advocates in the field are aware of that. Lovas defended the use of it in 2002, but had already withdrawn it at least once in 1997 in a paper with Tristan Smith, in which they said they were apologizing for the confusion about it. So if you kind of look a little more deeply, and I do apologize that I didn't do all of this on my own. I found a paper by Victoria Shay from England, who reviewed this body of research for the National Autism Society over in England. And I will go back and read some of her sources. I didn't read one of the dissertations, McCatchen's dissertation, which, trust me, I will do this week. But what she found was that recovery included the fact that teachers found no problem with these kids. But actually, they never asked the teachers, according to the dissertation. And indistinguishable from their peers was what was described as, really recovery. That, unfortunately, is the same term that Lovas had used in his paper with Riekers on the boy whose gender they tried to change, who apparently became, according to his family, became quite withdrawn and depressed over the years, and a couple of years ago committed suicide, and it was just recently on CNN. The third piece was I spent the first half of my career trying to get people to stop using aversives. And in 1987, 88 I think it is, some of these same objective scientists published a paper called The Right to Effective Behavioral Treatment. And I can tell you more about it privately. But actually, it was interesting on some and many dimensions. One of them is that it was published in 2 journals, a no-no. It was accepted in 12 days after receipt, which is astounding, to say the least. And it was accepted by one of the authors, which I thought was odd. And if you didn't already know, you would not know that effective really meant punishment, and therapeutic environments meant institutions, and so on and so forth. It was all code words. And finally, in the Lovas paper, there was something called the clinical rating scale, and it was about language, cognition, social, behavioral, and motor. And of course, people improved from the beginning of the study to the end. Turned out that that wasn't some official kind of, valid, reliable measure. Actually, it was a 20-minute interview by a graduate student who determined whether that had improved. So I'm not saying that they didn't do some good work. I'm saying the very notion that we are not human beings getting caught up in everything from ego to big money in this particular case has to be factored in to what we're thinking about. And I do have to tell you what pseudo-speciation is, because I feel it's so important. I won't read all of them, but it's making people so different that they actually are like another species. So in our case, we have to have autistic schools, autistic lunches, autistic residences, autistic workshops, autistic games, autistic buses. I'll tell you all about the bus if you like. and now autistic apps for our iPad, because they are so different from the rest of us that they're practically another species. I believe that that is a huge part of our science as well as our marketing. The issues of autism are not merely about science, they're about lifestyle. I think the questions we'd be asking about people with the label would be very different if they were all in decent lifestyles with good friends and sufficient money and a decent job and so forth, or good schools with playmates than presently the case. I think we have, moving to a separate point, I think with the DSM, about which I pay almost no attention because I've watched them change everything so many times in my career, and we make things up. And it's okay we make things up as long as we say we made it up. If we pretend that there's hard science between I think we went from psychosis of childhood, other type, to something called PDD and OS. As long as we say, we thought this would be useful, we thought a spectrum would be useful, but keep saying over and over again there's no spectrum, or there's no such thing as PDD and OS, I think we'll get a lot further. But in the meantime, it's invented knowledge. So my best guess is that what really unites people under the autism label is the similarities in the effect they have on the rest of us. Otherwise, they are in fact unique human beings just like the rest of us. And if you've met one person with autism, you've met exactly one person with autism. We're going to have to personalize what we do. My suggestions for the future, and I hope I have 1,000 more after today, we have to have autistic people on faculty and on research projects, not just sitting around at a meeting occasionally, but actually part of it. We should have conflict of interest statements on every submitted and published applied study and as well as the medical studies, so that we know whether there's, that there's the equivalent of a drug company out there who's going to make a lot of money for this particular person or this particular group. If the researcher is making money off the intervention, someone outside of that study has to do the evaluation. The fact that we have developed literally a gigantic business in a 40-hour-a-week behavior modification with the only evaluation being done by people who are part of that study, something's wrong here, and I don't think we'd allow it in a lot of other fields. And I think that we should require long-term follow-up to see whether there are any negative effects. The thought that we could be doing this kind of intervention to hundreds of thousands of kids in this country with no follow-up is dangerous and absurd. And in particular, I think we should have subjects, especially the recovered people, tell us their story so we might know how to do it better the next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Donnelly. Our next speaker is Commissioner Sharon Lewis of the Administration on Developmental Disabilities.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be here, and in particular, to be surrounded by an amazing table of colleagues, including our autistic adult perspectives, and I am just honored and very happy to be here. At ADD, one of our roles is to ensure that the voices of people with disabilities are central to everything that we do. And so many of the perspectives that have been shared already around the importance in the field of research that we are listening to people with autism, autistic adults, as well as families, is critically important. I'm going to talk a little bit today, as Ari has asked me to, about self-determination and our ideas around safety and harm. At the core of everything we do in our medical, educational, and human service delivery systems is an overarching value that protection of safety is primary, and that at all times we must be vigilant to ensure safety. Paid support systems and professional staff are judged and held accountable for health and safety standards and violations and measures as systems of licensure and certification focus on those criteria. We know that if children don't feel safe in school, they can't learn. Liability for safety pervades our culture and informs much of the decision-making related to people with disabilities. Parents, guardians, friends, and allies of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and autistic adults frequently and understandably place a very high value on basic safety for their loved ones. No one ever wants to see a person with a disability experience unnecessary harm, nor should we. Yet, we have little agreement about what constitutes harm in the name of benefit. Is it harmful to use aversives in order to modify behavior? Is it harmful to constrain movement when it is against an individual's will? Is it harm when we limit the decisions of individuals based solely on our perceptions of their disability? Is it harmful when we teach children and youth with disabilities to be overly dependent upon other people because we have not provided them with the opportunities to engage in self-determined behavior? The lack of core agreements around values and principles, as Ari articulated early in the day, drives the dissension in the answers to what I believe should be very, very simple questions about harm. Elimination of health and safety risk is impossible in any environment. It's impossible. And perhaps it's not desirable in some situations, especially when we prioritize safety in a manner that compromises the support of autonomy, equality, or self-determination. Or worse yet, when we compromise basic human and civil rights. Burton Blatt wrote, and I quote, that we betray the human race and in the final accounting the individual as well when we deny that the world must necessarily be a dangerous place. He argued that the freedom to make choices, even choices that may result in harm, is a freedom that most of us cherish. Who among us can claim that every decision we make is in our own best interest as it relates to health and safety? It certainly wasn't the framework that I thought through when I had that bowl of high-fat ice cream before I went to bed last night. As a parent of a 14-year-old with an intellectual disability, I am working to move her towards independent decision-making and supported decision-making in her life. And this comes up in different ways when we talk about adults and children, right? We acknowledge that children under our legal system are incapacitated individuals until they reach the age of majority at age 18. Unfortunately, we also think for many adults with disabilities that we continue to consider them in that same construct around decision-making. In about 4 years, that fundamental decision-making authority will shift from myself to my daughter. And if I don't provide her the opportunity to make mistakes and experience risk in the name of safety, what will happen to her as an adult? And this comes up for us frequently. One morning recently, she made bad choices in the morning and missed the bus, right? Not an unusual occasion in many people's life. And the consequence in our house is that she got to walk the 2.5 miles to school because she needs to learn the responsibility of getting off to the bus. She left. We had a friend follow along about a 1/2 mile behind her so that she had the responsibility of getting herself to school. I received a call later that day from another parent who knows my daughter in the community, expressing concern because at 9 o'clock in the morning, they had seen my daughter outside standing, talking to a group of individuals who are frequently in our neighborhood seeking day labor instead of being on the route to school, and expressed a safety concern about my daughter and her behavior in being in the community and speaking to other adults. And while I appreciated the eyes on, because at the end of the day, I think that's what's going to keep people safe, my question to the other parent was, would you be calling if my daughter didn't have a disability? The assumptions that we make and the presumptions that we make around safety and community around people with disabilities are different. As medical and educational and human services seek to assist and improve the quality of life for people with autism, and these services continue to develop and evolve, we have to have a better sense of how these approaches support or inhibit self-determined behavior. Far too many diagnostic, treatment, intervention, and service approaches currently do not presume competence consistent with that cultural bias in individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities, resulting in low expectation and a proclivity towards protecting such individuals from harm through the reduction of risk and the elimination of compromised safety. More than 40 years ago, Robert Persky wrote about how the efforts to protect individuals with disabilities from risk through limiting choice can diminish human dignity. 4 decades later, we continue to struggle with the balance and the inherent tension here. And what is self-determined behavior, and why does it matter? Researchers such as Michael Weimer make clear that self-determination is not a program, a curriculum, a model, or a process. Quote, self-determination is a characteristic of a person that refers to volitional actions that enable people to be causal agents in their life. All of us make hundreds of decisions every day that involve some degree of physical or emotional risk. I would consider exercising this volition to be a basic and human civil right that must always be considered as we design and evaluate our approaches to autism, be they medical, educational, behavioral, or support services. Supporting self-determined behavior must be a desired outcome with primacy. Safety and efficiency should not continue to receive undue emphasis at the cost or exclusion of this fundamental right. We do have research showing that people with disabilities who are self-determined are more successful because they are more likely to be goal-oriented, to have skills to self-regulate behavior, and to solve problems that remove them from those dangerous or difficult situations. But many wonder about the appropriateness of applying this self-determination construct to people with severe disabilities, believing that some people, in particular people who may be non-speaking or those with significant intellectual disabilities, lack the requisite skills to make and or communicate decisions, to express volition, and or that a lack of judgment would leave such individuals vulnerable and at significant risk of harm in all decision-making environments. As we prioritize limited resources and determine which issues to focus upon in research, not only do we need to utilize CBPR and the engagement and involvement of self-advocates, we also need to consider these ethical and civil rights implications of the research. Thinking about safety and self-determination, there are so many questions that need to be considered. What is a reasonable amount of risk for any human being, and who is responsible for determining that? What is the current rationale for defining risk and safety so very differently for people with disabilities? What are our assumptions about volition and supported decision-making? What is the inherent bias or basic values framework related to the presumption of competency that is informing our research and our study design? The opportunity to exercise self-determination in decisions big and small is critical to ensuring an improved quality of life for people with disabilities and should be considered as a core principle when conducting research to improve or to evaluate approaches in autism supports and services consistent with fundamental human and civil rights. Thanks.
So I want to just say one thing. Not only was that an exceptional presentation, but I happen to really like the slide that happened to be left up there from Anne's presentation. I almost wish that we didn't. Well, no, it wasn't. I almost wish that we didn't have more PowerPoints and we could keep that up all morning. For those of you who may not be able to see it, it says, well,
Oops,
it did
sorry.
say, that's fine, admit what we don't know. So we're going to get one. I like that. No, I think I smell a fundraising opportunity. That's superb. So what we're going to do is we're going to get one more presenter, then we're going to have a group discussion. Then, because I think it's very necessary and I'm willing to sacrifice some of our lunchtime to do it, let's take a 10-minute bathroom break after that. All right. Our next presenter is Dr. David Rose of CAST. I'm sure he'll tell us the acronym.
Actually, I can never quite remember what the acronym stands for myself. It stands for Center for Applied Special Technology, although we hate the title, so it's just CAST. I apologize for not being here yesterday. I was in Washington and had some amazing thing happen around Universal Design for Learning. Actually, so it'll preface my remarks. So Universal Design for Learning came out of work with students with disabilities, but our goal is to primarily change the regular education curriculum. So this week I was largely meeting with regular education, including all the assistant secretaries of education, in fact Sue also, in the disability arena, and with top people in the National Science Foundation and top people in the Gates Foundation, all of which are coming together around, we need to really break up the regular education curriculum and make it into a good one. And it's kids with disabilities that will show us how. So so I apologize for being late, but I think actually be happy to talk about later some things that are happening that I think are kind of neat. So Universal Design for Learning, I just want to say what it is. I think everybody knows the idea of universal design in architecture. The idea is instead of fixing up a building do aftermarket repair, that you build a building from the beginning so everybody can use it. It's cheaper, better. You can make it aesthetically beautiful because it's always expensive and ugly to fix up a building later so that it has a ramp or something in it. So universal design in architecture now is completely commonplace. Every architect learns universal design. So we had kids who would come who had physical disabilities and their buildings were inaccessible to them, and those were fixed by putting in ramps. But what we found was their curricula were inaccessible to them. They weren't able to learn in their curricula, and there was no universal design for their curricula. So they, in fact, were ostracized by the very thing that was supposed to help them learn. So Universal Design for Learning came out of that idea, and it came from two sources: advances in the learning sciences and advances in the technologies for learning. So I just want to highlight really quickly a couple of elements of those. So I don't have time to go into kind of modern cognitive neuroscience, but probably a lot of you have known there's been a tremendous set of advances. So I just want to highlight one. One of the key findings of modern neuroscience is the fundamental truth of variability, that when you read studies, be careful, because they'll often report results, and it's already been mentioned here, as if they stand for all. But in fact, if you ask for the slides, or if they're a good researcher, they'll say the variability was huge, because it always is. So if people give a talk and they say, basically, Broca's area is here, always ask at the end, how much variability was there? And then they might choke and they say, well, actually, there's a lot of variability on where Broca's area is. Anyway, variability is a truth of neuroscience for sure. We have very different brains. At CAST, we divide up, as lots of people do, the brain into three just broad kinds of networks, so that we are sort of Catholic and careful about the kinds of diversity we look at. So these are the three areas I just highlighted here. One is called strategic networks, the networks that are in the front of your brain that allow you to take action on the world. Strategic action, can act purposefully, intentionally, and effectively on the world, including motor movement, but strategic motor movement. The back of your brain, it's always very consistent, by the way, no matter where you look, the thalamus, the brainstem, cortex, the back of your brain is always sensory. It's where information comes in and gets turned into usable knowledge. And in green here, the middle of your brain has a very different function, which I love that Ari begins with values. This is the values part of your brain. When your brain, the key aspect of our intelligence really is that we value things. This is more important to look at than that. This is more important to remember than that. This is something to be frightened of. This is something to be excited by. The internal core of your brain is about affect, motivation, what drives the brain. Some people think of the brain as an information processing device. No neuroscientist thinks about the brain as an information processing device. It's a goal-driven device. So the center of your brain is all about affect. So in each of these three areas in Universal Design for Learning, we look at what are the sources of variability? How do people differ? And I don't have time to go through all these, but I just want to highlight that they go from things you'd expect in the disability world, differences in perception. People don't perceive the world the same. People are blind, people are deaf, people have all kinds of perceptual differences. Second, going up this column, symbol recognition. People are very different in the way that they can decode symbols, the kind of vocabularies they have, the kinds of symbols, et cetera, all sorts of things. The symbolic capacities are very different, and those are partly biological and partly environmental. If you come from France, you don't speak English very well, okay? But our brains reflect that. You can see the English brain. But lastly, most importantly, comprehension. That this part of our brain allows us to take sensory information in, even in symbolic form, and turn it into something you understand, comprehension. That's what we want to get to in schools. So I just want to highlight for fun an example that actually overlaps nice with autism for me. So here's an area in the brain in this back part of recognition cortex, and areas 41 and 42. It's auditory cortex. And auditory cortex, among other things, allows you to recognize pitch. And this is a picture of me and my wife. My wife has perfect pitch. Some of you, I bet you have perfect pitch. But especially if you're on the spectrum, as they say, you're more likely to have perfect pitch. We'll get to that in a minute. But Ruth has perfect pitch. And I'm different than Ruth. I have not so much perfect pitch. And so I can know that a note is high or low. That's probably like a lot of you, but I don't know that it's an A. Ruth absolutely knows anything that's played, whether it's a cell phone or your trumpet or piano or whatever. Ruth, if it's 440 beats, Ruth goes, that's an A. And you can't mistake her. It's not hard. She doesn't have to think about it. It's just, she's fast at it. Okay. And we know something about the neuroscience of perfect pitch. And I love it. Someone was earlier saying she's not even here right now, but the negative that it's usually described as. But anyway, so in this case, people with perfect pitch, when you look at the anatomy, they're hyper-connected. They just have more connections in this specific area of auditory cortex, and they're asymmetric. They have more on one side. They have a large area devoted to pitch on the left side and not on the right. So they're different. You can look at it and see it. Now the question is, who has a disability? Okay, so it all depends, and that's the main point. To Ruth, who came from a family that was musical, and she was fabulous at pitch and everything. Music was very important. And so to her, who expected marriage to be something like The Sound of Music, where we'd have kids and we'd sing an 8-part harmony on Volkswagen vans and stuff, it was horrible to marry this disabled guy, and that worse, that he passed it on to our children, so that we can't, as a family, sing like The Sound of Music. So to Ruth, she has married a disabled husband, and he has passed it on to our kids. But as someone else was saying earlier, everything is contextual. And I can describe a context in which things look different. We go to a church together, not far from here, and in that church, it's my only chance during the week to sing, so I sing pretty loud. But I'm not exactly on pitch, just like you wouldn't be on pitch. I'm somewhere near the 440, but not exactly on it. But the people around her also aren't singing 440. They're singing something else close by. And we have a really old church, so the organ actually has long ago drifted away from 440. It's not really playing 440. So Ruth can look at the hymn book, and it says A, and she knows how to sing 440, but she's in the conflict of does she essentially socialize with her husband and sing whatever he sings, which is not going to be A? Does she sing what the organ's singing, because that's 18th century organ and whatever? So Ruth actually can't sing in church. It's too disabling to be, because what you want in church is relative pitch. You just sing with everybody else, and you don't pay too much attention to being accurate. So Ruth, if she were in Juilliard School of Music, is an A student. In church, I love the irony that people in church think of me as the really good singer, and they think of Ruth as the disabled singer, and I love it. Okay, and we go through essentially a cast and look at what is the variance, what are the sources of variance in these other three parts of the brain, which I'm not going to do here. Affect is a really key one. And then we look at what are the things, what are the options and alternatives? Universal design is always about providing options. So there are many ways to move around in the building. What we want is many ways for kids to move around in the curriculum. So we look at what are the ways in which we present information? What are the options so we can have kids who can't decode very well can do well in this curriculum? Kids who are super decoders can do well in this curriculum, et cetera. So we talk about multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression. Those three networks. We look at each of those are sources of variance, normal variance. Second, sorry, I'm talking fast because this is 10 minutes is fast. Second part of universal design is advances in the technologies of learning, because doing those options and alternatives is very hard in a traditional classroom of books and lectures. They are standardized uniforming. Everybody gets the same thing in a lecture or a book. They don't do that. In the modern digital world, we have great opportunities to go away from a fixed, everybody gets the same one-size-fits-all textbook, and into environments that are new media environments where we can, in fact, individualize in the following ways. What I like about new media is there's a separation between the information and the way it's displayed. So we can do a lot of things with that. So here I have the information displayed, and a display device, a computer screen. Could be a cell phone, could be your refrigerator, could be anything. Forget about NIMUS and XML for the moment. So with that flexible display, I can take the same information, display it in many different fonts, many different languages. As you probably know, Google now has a media translation to 42 languages, things like that. So we can take the same information, put it out in very different ways. But much more interesting, we can display it in not just visually, we can display it as tactile text. There's refreshable automatic braille devices, so we can take that same information and say, do you want it visually? Do you want it in this language? Do you want it in this color? Do you want to touch it instead? And you know we can make it speak itself. Everything now speaks itself. We can make it be oral language. We can even turn it out as automatic ASL now for kids who are deaf. Same information, many different displays. And a lot more things like that are true of this world. And I don't really have time to do this because I want to just get to my last paragraph, my last minute, but this is an example of an environment called Expert Space. I like the title. This is from Scholastic. Scholastic bought Grolier's Encyclopedia, and they said, how could we make this universally designed for learning so everybody can learn in it? Because they can't use the encyclopedia. It's too narrowband. So this is what it looks like when you open up. You go into a topic, you choose a good topic. It has executive function supports built in that are great for kids with autism, but great for a whole wide range of kids. I just want to show what a topic looks like. When you get into a topic, the first thing you do is watch a video, because a lot of kids are not good readers. A lot of kids don't come from our culture. First thing is make something that everybody in the classroom can share. We watch the video first, get a grounding. We get the vocabulary. We get the big ideas first. So we start from a common island. And then you go to an article, but that article has many multiple representations. But one of them is you can ask for the article to come in many different ways. You can ask for it to talk to you. You can ask for it in different lexile levels, get the different levels of syntactic complexity so it's right for you. You can ask for the whole article in Spanish. Many options like this. And for kids who aren't organized, it has a beautiful note card function, not just note cards, but the ability to scaffold you in learning how to take notes. And this is much better done in real life digital. But whenever you need help, you can see up there it says, do you need help in note taking? And out comes a mentor, and he says, here's how to take notes. Do you want to practice with me? So all built into the environment so that you can, any student can make good progress. Blind, deaf, autistic, blah, blah, blah. What's cool about doing these kinds of environments is that individuals with autism are great teachers, because what we want is an environment that is diverse enough that everybody can do well in school. And so what CAS does is try to pay attention to what are the things that the widest variety of students really need. And there's more things than that, blah, blah, blah. But when you have environments like this that can be much more supportive and encouraging to a wide range of students, and where not every student is expected to get to the goal in the same way, then we move from disability to diversity, realizing that our classrooms are very diverse rather than that there are some with disabilities and some not. And what happens in schools, unfortunately, is schools should be as variable as our students are. That is, there should be as many ways to represent and many ways to express and all of that as our schools are. And that would be good. In fact, usually what happens is our schools are narrowband. We use textbooks. You're all going to have to do it the same way, or we're all going to give a speech in the same way. And what that does is essentially disable our students. And so the way that we see it at CAS now is we think of not students as being disabled, but our schools are disabled. And I'd love it if it wasn't, if you viewed autism without the negative tinge. Most of our schools are autistic, is the reality. Why? They don't have a good theory of mind of our students. They don't understand the full range of our students, including students who are on the spectrum. It's schools that don't have a theory of mind. They don't know how does that child learn. It's going to be different, and we need technologies for learning that are diverse enough to include that. So when you're doing those IP and thinking about it, the first thing to do is remove the disabilities in our schools first, then we can label our kids. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to say that I think one of the biggest takeaways of the presentations we've had so far is we're going to need to do a symposium like this again really soon. We're going to take 10 minutes to discuss some of these things, and then we're going to take a 10-minute break. Let's go to our respondents first, Cheryl and Samantha Crane. Cheryl Jorgensen, you want to kick us off?
Is that okay, Samantha? Again, there's my mic. As I listened to the 4 panel presentations, 6 questions came into my mind. So I'd like to pose those six questions to you. And I hope they're not just rhetorical questions. I hope that they are questions that will lead us to developing an ethic and an ethic that informs not only research, but educational practices for students with autism. So question number 1. Why do we continue to use the term disorder or even disability? If we can put a person on the moon, why can't we figure out how to educate children and provide community supports for adults without having to label them as being sick or disordered or anything? I think we should stop doing it. So I answer my own question. Question number 2, and this refers back to Anne Donnelly's presentation. Should we really continue to identify students with the educational label of autism if that label might not be valid and is based primarily on invented knowledge? Question number 3. If we continue to identify 10 to 20% of our students as disabled and continue to build and expand a special education system for those students, how will we ever promote a respect for all learning individualities and the adoption of curriculum and instruction that accommodates those individualities? Question number 4. Given all the flaws inherent in intelligence testing, why should we continue to use IQ tests in educational assessments? We should just stop doing that. Question number 5. Why should our public education system continue to validate segregation for children with disabilities through the least restrictive environment principle within IDEA? And question number 6. How can education policy promote inclusive and universally designed instruction without asserting too much control over individual teachers' creativity and the uniqueness of each school and its community? So I think that if maybe we had an agreed upon set of ethics, ethics being values into practice, that could guide the education of students with autism, then we might be able to answer these questions. Martin Bullmer said, quote, "Ethics is a matter of principled sensitivity to the rights of others. Ethics say that while truth is good, respect for human dignity is better, even if in the extreme case, the respect for human dignity leaves one ignorant of human nature." So the 6 ethics that I would propose, I tried to be clever, and the first word of each ethic corresponds to the letters in the word ethics, so ETHICS. So the first ethic, and again, ethics being values into practice, because ethics standing on their own don't do anything to improve the lives of people. The first ethic is about equity and excellence. I believe that equity and excellence go together. Can't have one without the other, and that's true for all students. The second ethic, tender care. An ethic of caring, and I don't mean charity, and I don't mean benevolence, and I don't mean paternalism, but an ethic of caring should be the moral foundation of schooling. The third ethic, high expectations and presumed competence. I believe that all students with autism are able, with the right instruction and supports, to communicate and learn in ways that are commensurate with their same age peers without disabilities, and that in the absence of evidence about competence, and this is homage to Anne Donnelly, the least dangerous assumption should be to presume competence. Fourth ethic is inclusion. I believe that diversity enhances learning and community, and that separate is never equal. Fifth ethic is community. I believe that children themselves, their parents, guardians, and educators must work together in order for students with autism to get a high-quality education. And then the final ethic is around self-advocacy and pride. I believe that autism, as others have said, is a natural part of the human experience, and that no educational practices should be used that purport to eliminate or cure autism or those autistic characteristics that are life-affirming for a particular student. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Samantha?
I wrote down a bunch of comments to make, some of which, I mean, I'm going to try and make them sound related to each other, but we'll see if I succeed at that. So the first comment that I really feel needs to be emphasized in response to Sharon's lecture is the concept of safety and who even defines what safety is. Many people who have been institutionalized, who have been in segregated environments, or who have otherwise been subjected to coercive interventions will say that this made them worlds less safe than anything else that would have been considered risky, like letting someone walk to school. What coercive interventions do, what facilities do, is they teach passivity. And there are lots of people who are either just really bad people or who are, kind of just minorly bad people who take advantage of a situation and will exploit that passivity or, trained agreeableness or just plain confusion in autistic people for their own purposes. And I think that, just sort of getting into the theory of mind here, this might be because a lot of the parent advocates and provider advocates think like, well, I'm nice and I would never abuse anyone, and so I don't have to worry about how this might cause parents to abuse autistic people because parents don't do that, because I don't do that. And this is very dangerous. A lot of people don't understand the effects they're having on other people, so they are not going to understand that something that they consider very nice might be perceived as abusive. And they're also not understanding that, even if you're the best parent in the world, not everyone has the best parent in the world. Not everyone is in the best facility in the world with the nicest people and woodland creatures, and you have to be careful of all of the ways that things can go wrong. And many people, autistic people, will have had situations where they've been severely taken advantage of by others or abused because of these mechanisms and behaviors that we've been taught to be agreeable, and if I'm uncomfortable with this, I'm probably wrong, and if I think that this person's motivations are different from what they're saying, maybe I'm probably wrong because they've got some sort of social disability. So everything I think is wrong, and I shouldn't trust myself when I think I need to get out of here. So I definitely wanted to emphasize that, and it reminds me of a rebranding campaign among people who farmed caged chickens. There's a movement towards free range chicken, and you should have the chickens be pecking around and doing whatever comes naturally to them. And the industry of people who had chickens in sort of more confined enclosures were really were trying to get away from the negative connotations of putting chickens in cages, so they called it the safe hen farming practice. And you know, like, yes, they're safe from whatever might be outside, but it's still not, you know, necessarily that great. Another thing that I think needs to be done, and you know, this is somewhat connected to my analysis of what people are thinking when they think that, you know, the danger is the outside world, the danger is strangers because I'm the most caring person in the world and I would never abuse someone, is that we need to research the researchers. We can't let autism research be just on autistic people. We need to research the pervasive, you know, biases in how people view autistic people, framing effects, where a completely innocuous mistake or a completely, you know, not particularly dangerous situation or a pretty, you know, a minorly bad event that might happen to someone, when in the context of an autistic person, everyone will think like, this is why autistic people are so unsafe and they can't handle their own situation. If I eat you know, packaged food every day and I don't tell anyone that I'm autistic, I'm just a single woman with a career and no time. If I say, like, I eat packaged food and don't cook for myself and I am autistic, people will say that I lack self-care skills. Yeah. You know, I watch TV. I'm pretty sure that, you know, many single women portrayed on TV have some significant self-care deficits. And, you know, I might be just kind of like them. And another thing when we talk about researching the researchers is try and actually question the ways that we try to reduce bias. A really good study had been done on stigma and schizophrenia, and they found that despite the fact that everyone thought it would be really helpful and it would really reduce stigma if we just convinced everyone that schizophrenia was just a brain disorder and it's all in the brain and there's something incredibly wrong with these people's brains, and it's totally not their environment and it's totally not, you know, anything about their personality. It did lead people to blame people less when they found out that the person was schizophrenic. They didn't have a moral judgment of the person, but they also didn't want to live near the person, they didn't want to work near the person, and they didn't want that person marrying into their family. Because once you, if you frame something entirely as a brain difference, you pseudo-speciate. You have people who say, this person, I don't understand. I normally understand what other people are going to do. I have a sense of them as other people, but if someone's got some sort of pervasive problem with their brain, God knows. I'm creeped out by that, and I don't really quite see this as a person, and I'm maybe a little scared of them. So when we talk about reducing stigma, I think we really need to question received knowledge about what that even means. The same study found that people were much more likely to want to live near a person with schizophrenia, work near a person with schizophrenia, if they were just presented with a positive example of a person with schizophrenia, just describing this as, you know, dude with schizophrenia, living, working, this is how they feel about having a disability, this is how what they want to do with their lives, these are their goals, and this actually reduced stigma quite a bit. So those were my comments.
Very worthwhile comments. Let's get a sense of who here would like to speak up. I think, Glenn, you haven't said anything yet, so why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so one thing I'll say, just a quick quip, is the most interesting thing, Dr. Donnelly, about that study you told us about where the person accepted their own abstract was that it took them 13 days to do so, right? 12 days, excuse me, to do so. You might think the peer review would have been really quick on that one, but I don't know. On a little bit of a more serious note, I wanted to...
apparently it's just a little too loud.
Oh, I'm sorry. On a little bit of a more serious note, I want to suggest the notion of diagnosis, kind of two conceptions of diagnosis. The first is the notion of it as being a scientific enterprise, the second of it being a political enterprise, and the idea that the move from DSM-4 to DSM-5 has distributional consequences in terms of winners and losers. There's people whose stigma are increased, people whose stigma are decreased. But I do want to maybe partially dissent from the notion of individuation that you were pushing, the idea that if you know one autistic person, that's all you know is one autistic person. That I think in the process of getting research funding, in the process of getting legitimacy, in the process of self-organization, I think those differences are real, but I think as a political enterprise, it is important to create diagnostic criteria only because it allows self-organization around it and funding. And really in a world where you push the individuation thing too much, one has 1 million people or however many people in this world who are fighting alone, as opposed to a group of people who, you're right, they're heterogeneous, they may not be completely together, but at least there's a way in which diagnostic criteria are unifying.
I think that's very interesting, and let me just throw one thing out there just to spark continued discussion on that point, particularly about the criteria. I think one of the biggest problems that the DSM has is it's trying to do two things at once. It's trying to serve as a tool for identification, so figuring out who is autistic, and it's also trying to serve to some degree or another as a tool for figuring out what people should be doing about that, so what the objectives of intervention should be, and things of that nature. And I think on the first question, I think you're very much right. The question of figuring out who is autistic, you do want a larger social group there, both at a political question and also because it does provide some useful information. And I often draw the distinction between what is a label and what is an identity. And it's really a distinction between who feels a sense of ownership in the process. On the second question, I think that's really where you run into more problems, where you say, well, the conclusion of what being autistic means as far as service provision, education, and any number of other things, when that becomes standardized, that's really where we need to push for that rush for individuation. But I think your point with regards to the occasional utility of groupings is very well taken. What do other people think about that?
I would just like to say it was my intention to be looking at intervention, not the politics. I think that there's real value in politics, if nothing else, for example, parents and people with a label to get together.
I would agree that as we're talking about interventions, that the labeling actually becomes problematic, and that far too often the labeling or the definition of diagnosis becomes a shortcut that prevents individuation. And I think for parents, for educators, and for the medical community, I would agree with Anne's comment that you've met one person with autism, or you've met one person with X, you've met one person. And in my experience as a parent, we have worked very, very hard to ensure that my daughter's education is based on her needs and not a label, and as such have actively chosen, despite the system's constraints, to avoid any of the traditional labels in having her access services through other health impairment, simply because it requires then the educators to presume nothing, because that is a meaningless label. And I would argue that if we are truly trying to achieve an acknowledgement of individual learning characteristics, that's a far more effective process than making presumptions based on diagnosis.
So, two more comments and then the break. And I'm pleased, by the way, that we have a soundtrack to this evening. Thank you. And if we can please remind folks to silence their cell phones. Stephen, and then just so I know who's going to be our Stephen, then Sue Swenson. Okay.
Well, I agree with many of the points that have been said, but to what some of the questions that Cheryl raised about, and others have alluded to, about should we even be labeling people at all. I think, well, part of it is that sometimes people confuse disability with inability, and they make disability into a bad word and something that it isn't. And because it doesn't necessarily mean that someone can't do something, but they might do it differently. They might have to work harder or take longer, at least at first. So if we can understand that, and I think even in the so-called medical model or medical community, that they're understanding much more now, as I was suggesting, how much so many disabilities are a natural human variation that is complex and on a very complicated spectrum where the various traits might be multidimensional and disassociable from one another, and that they form a kind of a constellation, different degrees and combinations of so-called, of behaviors in a symptomatic sense that truly do get a label, and ultimately the purpose is for access to services. And it's true that there are all sorts of problems with how interventions, et cetera, are offered in practice. And ideally, if we had no labels, if we didn't have a need, we would have a society where everyone would be getting the individualized support that they would need. But since the realities are that that doesn't happen and people get civil rights protections and other access to services, ultimately the goal of interventions so it can help people get support, but how should that support be practiced? And I think it should be focusing on adaptive behaviors, helping people to build useful skills related to social relationships, education, employment, daily and independent, which doesn't mean not supported living. And sometimes that's also considered, quote, objective quality of life, but then quality of life is also often, the subjective version of it is called, subjective well-being, or variations of that, meaning that it's not just being, quote, successful or whatever in those normative senses, but it's also, what do people even want for their lives? And that goes to why we should be including people, not just autistic people, but other disabled people, other minority groups in the research process and in various matters about our lives. And it's also true what I was saying about context, that the same difference or trait that may be an advantage in one context might be a disadvantage in another, and especially when something is defined as so social, and that brings us into the social context. And then how are we ignoring, we're defining it so socially, but then I haven't seen a lot of autism literature that really goes into the social psychology literature, community, cultural psychology, or, dare I say, sociology.
Very well put. Sue, you have the last word, and then we go to break.
I think somebody's had a hand up for a painful amount of time over there.
Over where?
Right there in the second row.
Can we actually, I think we're planning on doing that at the end. So I'll follow up with them during the break.
I just want to point out one fact that over the last 30 years, the proliferation of different diagnoses has not applied only to autism, but in 1970 there were 7 family advocacy organizations that spoke up on behalf of people with a broad range of intellectual and developmental disabilities, and now there are certainly well over 1,000. And the advocacy, because the distinction of the groups is driven by diagnosis, the advocacy tends to be focused on more diagnosis and more cure. So we have minute slices of diagnoses, and we're going to go out and advocate for more, and there's very little understanding of advocacy across or inclusive of what are supports, what are natural supports, what can we expect, what can we drive. I mean, I would argue that the cliff that kids experience when they come out of school is largely a construct of some bizarre expectation that any child with an IEP is going to have social services provided to them. This is simply untrue, and it simply has never been true that in our society that we're serving 12% of the people in some kind of social service system. It's not viable. And we need to be thinking about what are the natural supports and connections that help people live their lives, and then how can we insert tiny bits of help for people who are highly dependent on those tiny bits of help without overtaking their entire life under case management and all of the other constructs that come along with social services. So to some extent what I'm saying here is, to the extent that we talk only about autism, we are shooting ourselves in both feet at the same time. And to the extent that we identify with the disability movement writ large and begin to talk about what is political action and equity on that side, then there is power. But if you allow yourselves to be limited to autistic people, there's a minimal amount of power. Or it only concerns power to advocate for diagnosis and cure.
Exceedingly well put. With that, I'd like to suggest we take a 10-minute break. I'll see you all back here at 11:55. And thank you all for an extraordinary beginning to our discussion.
It's gonna be a very